The void of space had always been quiet, a vast ocean of darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. The crew of the Keshri fleet had traveled for months, patrolling the outer edges of their empire, confident in their superiority. They had conquered weaker species before, civilizations that crumbled under the might of their advanced weaponry. This mission was supposed to be routine, an inspection of a newly discovered system, a place barely worth noting on the galactic maps. But something was wrong. Commander Railgun stood at the bridge, his eyes locked onto the screen displaying the incoming data from their long-range scanners. "This can't be right," he muttered, his clawed fingers tightening around the console. His second-in-command, Lyric, flicked his tail in unease. "What is it, Commander?" Railgun didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the readings of a planet labeled as Earth. It was classified as a pre-warp civilization, technologically primitive by galactic standards. Yet the energy signatures coming from its surface, they didn't make sense. The levels of concentrated kinetic energy were far beyond anything a planet-bound species should be capable of generating. And worse, there was movement. Something had detected them. "Sir, we have incoming projectiles." The voice of the sensor officer cut through the silence like a blade. Lyric spun to face the display, his crest flattening in alarm. "Projectiles? From them?" His voice was laced with disbelief. "They don't have the capability for orbital engagement. There's no record of energy-based weapons strong enough to." "It's not energy-based," the officer interrupted, his voice strained. "It's something else. Massive slugs of metal traveling at a fraction of light speed." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Railgun's eyes widened in realization. He had studied warfare for decades, seen countless strategies employed across the stars. But this was something old. Something brutal. "Kinetic weaponry," he breathed. Lyric turned to him, confusion written all over his features. "That's impossible. No one uses mass drivers at that scale. It's inefficient. It's terrifying," Railgun finished for him. His mind raced. Most civilizations had abandoned projectile weapons long ago, shifting to plasma and energy-based arsenals that could be sustained indefinitely. Kinetic weapons required enormous resources, insane levels of power to launch, and yet if they were fast enough, if they were heavy enough, they could punch through almost anything. Impact in 20 seconds. The officer's voice was near panic now. Railgun forced himself to focus. Evasive maneuvers. All ships brace for impact. The Keshri fleet wasn't prepared for this. They had expected to find a civilization barely crawling out of its gravity well, not one that could launch devastating weapons from the surface of a single planet into space. This was no backwater species playing with primitive rockets. The humans had railguns. Railgun barely had time to process the thought before the first impact struck. The flagship trembled violently, alarms blaring as the force of the impact tore through its outer armor like it was paper. One of the escort ships was gone in an instant, reduced to a rapidly expanding cloud of debris. Shock rippled through the bridge crew. Lyric's voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of species builds weapons like this?" Railgun didn't have an answer. The Keshri Empire had dominated the stars for centuries, believing themselves untouchable, unmatched in war. But now, in a sector of space they had dismissed as insignificant, they had encountered something truly horrifying. A species that had never developed energy weapons. A species that had never needed them. And as more projectiles lit up the void, hurtling toward them with merciless precision, Railgun understood the mistake they had made. They had underestimated humanity. The Keshri fleet was in chaos. The moment the first projectile struck, the elegant formation they had maintained crumbled. Ships scrambled to adjust their trajectories, engines flaring bright as they attempted to escape the unseen assault. But the humans weren't giving them that chance. More slugs tore through the darkness, silent and deadly, moving too fast for the eye to track. Railgun gripped the railing as the flagship's hull groaned under the strain of another impact. Sparks burst from an overhead console, the acrid smell of burnt wiring filling the bridge. "Report," he barked. The sensor officer's hands trembled over the controls. 2 cruisers destroyed. The Skirash and Velinar, they're just gone, sir. Their hulls didn't hold. His voice cracked. The humans hit us before we even knew they fired. Railgun's mind raced. How is this possible? How could a species still bound to their homeworld possess this kind of power? Kinetic weapons weren't new. Many had experimented with them in the past, but no empire had ever made them this efficient, this devastating. Energy weapons ruled the battlefield for a reason. They were faster, reusable, and required minimal ammunition. Kinetic rounds, on the other hand, needed mass, needed raw materials, needed. His stomach sank. Lyric, he said, voice tight. What do we know about this planet's resources? Lyric's crest twitched as he rapidly scanned his display. Earth is rich, sir. Heavy metals, rare elements, dense planetary core. He hesitated. And its inhabitants have been at war with themselves for most of their history. Their records show constant conflict. They've been refining weapons for centuries. VRYNN exhaled sharply. That explained too much. Unlike most advanced civilizations, who had moved past war once they reached a certain level of technology, humanity had never stopped. They had learned to perfect the art of destruction long before they ever reached space. A warning siren blared. More incoming, the sensor officer shouted. It's not just slugs. I'm detecting, he swallowed hard. They've launched something bigger. VRYNN felt a cold dread settle in his chest. Show me. The screen shifted, revealing a new set of readings. Whatever the humans had fired this time was enormous. Dozens of meters long, moving slower than the previous projectiles, but still at terrifying speed. It wasn't just a slug of metal. This was something guided. Lyric inhaled sharply. That's not just a railgun round. That's a torpedo. A kinetic missile, massive in size, relying purely on its sheer bulk and velocity to destroy whatever it touched. There was no energy signature, no obvious warhead. Just a slab of reinforced metal traveling fast enough to turn entire ships into scrap. The Keshri had shields, but they weren't built for this kind of assault. Shields were designed to deflect or absorb energy-based attacks, to weaken plasma bursts or dissipate laser fire. But a solid object moving at this speed? It would cut through their defenses like they weren't even there. Divert power to engines. VRYNN ordered. Break formation and scatter. Now! The fleet obeyed instantly, thrusters firing at full burn as the ships tried to spread out. But the humans had accounted for that. The missile adjusted its course mid-flight, tracking its target with mechanical precision. It wasn't some primitive dumbfire weapon, it was smart. And it was locked onto them. The bridge crew watched in horror as the missile closed the distance. VRYNN clenched his jaw. They had underestimated the humans. And now they were paying the price. Then, in the midst of the chaos, another signal flickered on the screen. A transmission. VRYNN's eyes narrowed. They're hailing us? Lyric hesitated. It seems so. Why would the humans be sending a message now? They were winning. They didn't need to talk. Unless this was something worse than war. VRYNN took a slow breath, then gave a single command. Open the channel. The bridge fell silent as the transmission connected. The screen flickered, then stabilized. What VRYNN saw made his blood run cold. The figure staring back at him was human. A male, broad-shouldered, wearing what appeared to be a military uniform. His expression was unreadable, eyes steady, cold. There was no sign of fear, no hesitation. He knew exactly what he was doing. This is Admiral David Kessler of the United Terran Defense Force, the man said, his voice calm but firm. You are trespassing in Sol space. You have fired upon our world. He leaned slightly forward. That was a mistake. VRYNN tightened his grip on the railing. His mind raced, searching for the right response. If the humans thought the Keshri had come here with hostile intent, this could spiral into something far worse. We did not come to attack, VRYNN said carefully. We were observing. We did not know your species possessed, he paused, choosing his words. This level of technology. Kessler's expression didn't change. And yet you brought a fleet. Lyric glanced at VRYNN, his crest twitching in unease. They had been exposed. The humans weren't naive. They knew an armada of warships didn't arrive just to observe. We do not seek war, VRYNN said, keeping his tone even. But your weapons are unexpected. The Admiral studied him for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You thought we were defenseless. His voice was quieter now, but somehow even more dangerous. You thought Earth was weak. VRYNN didn't answer. He didn't have to. Kessler continued. I've seen your ships, studied the wreckage of the ones we've destroyed. Your kind relies on energy weapons. Shields. You assumed that because we don't use the same methods, we must be primitive. He tilted his head slightly. But that's not how war works, Commander. Something in his tone sent a chill through the bridge. This wasn't a speech. This was a lesson. For centuries we fought each other, Kessler went on. Before we ever reached space, before we ever dreamed of colonizing the stars, we were already perfecting destruction. Our wars shaped us, forced us to innovate, to adapt. When energy weapons became viable, we studied them. He gestured vaguely. They had their uses. But kinetic weapons? They never stopped being effective. VRYNN had never felt so exposed. Everything Kessler said made sense now. Humanity had refined war to an art long before they turned their eyes to the cosmos. Where other species abandoned outdated weaponry, humans kept improving it. Where others saw inefficiency, humans saw reliability. The sensor officer swallowed hard. "Sir," he whispered. "The missile, it's still locked onto us." VRYNN's pulse quickened. Kessler hadn't deactivated the weapon. It was still coming. The Admiral seemed to notice his reaction. A hint of amusement flickered in his expression, but it vanished just as quickly. "You wanted to study us," he said. "Well, here's what you need to understand, Commander." The screen zoomed out, showing a live feed of the incoming projectile. The sheer size of it filled the display. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a message. "You're not the first to come here assuming we're easy prey," Kessler continued. "Others have tried. Pirates, raiders, even a few empires like yours, testing our defenses." He leaned in slightly. "None of them are around anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The bridge crew was frozen. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Kessler tapped something off-screen. "I'm giving you one chance to leave," he said. "Turn around. Go home. Tell your leaders what you found here." His expression darkened. "Because if you don't, I promise you, this is nothing compared to what we're capable of." The screen went black. VRYNN stared at the empty display. His heart pounded in his chest. "Orders, sir?" Lyric asked quietly. The missile was still coming. It wasn't a bluff. The humans had given them a choice. And VRYNN wasn't sure if their empire would survive making the wrong one. The missile was still closing in. Silent. Unstoppable. Death itself hurtling through space. VRNN's claws dug into the armrest of his command chair. The bridge crew held their breath, waiting for an order. But what could he say? He had never been in a situation like this before. The Keshri Empire had faced resistance, yes, but never from a species like this. Never from something that fought with such ruthless efficiency. "Time to impact?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Less than 60 seconds, the sensor officer whispered. Lyric took a cautious step forward. "Sir, we need to act now. Shields won't stop that thing. We have to." "I know," VRYNN snapped. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to think. The humans had given them an ultimatum. Retreat or die. He wanted to believe it was a bluff, but everything about Admiral Kessler told him otherwise. They weren't bluffing. They had fired this weapon knowing it would end the battle before it even began. It wasn't a test shot. It wasn't a warning. It was proof that the humans had already won. But why not destroy them outright? Why give them a chance to run? That question gnawed at VRYNN as he stared at the trajectory on the display. This was a species bred by war, one that had survived through relentless conflict. And yet they had held back. "Sir, the fleet is awaiting your command," Lyric urged. "If we leave now, we might escape." VRYNN hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to return to the Empire and report what they had found. But something in the back of his mind wouldn't let go of one simple fact. Humans never stopped improving their weapons. This wasn't the limit of their firepower. If they had railguns capable of striking ships from the surface, if they had kinetic missiles that could track targets with terrifying precision, then what else were they hiding? What weapons had they not used yet? He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. "Sir." The missile's proximity alert blared through the bridge. VRYNN's jaw tightened. All ships full retreat. Engines roared to life. The fleet broke formation, thrusters burning white-hot as they pulled away from Earth's gravity well. The missile adjusted its trajectory slightly, still locked onto them, still closing in. It had been designed for this, to hunt, to chase, to kill. And then, at the last possible second, it stopped. Not exploded. Not deactivated. Just stopped. It hung in the void, motionless, a silent executioner waiting for an order that never came. The bridge was dead silent. Lyric stared at the screen in disbelief. They let us go." VRYNN's hands tightened into fists. No, this wasn't mercy. This was something else. A warning. A demonstration. A message written in cold metal and physics. The humans had let them leave not because they were afraid, but because they wanted the Keshri to spread the fear instead. They wanted their enemies to know exactly what awaited them if they ever returned. Vryn swallowed hard, watching as Earth grew smaller on the screen. He had his orders. He would report to the Empire, tell them what he had seen. But deep down, he already knew the truth. The Keshri had made a mistake, and they had only just begun to understand how dangerous that mistake truly was. Vryn sat in his quarters, staring at the silent void outside the viewport. Earth was nothing more than a distant dot now, but its presence lingered like a shadow in his mind. The fleet was in full retreat, the crew shaken but alive. Yet, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. The humans had let them go. That was what terrified him the most. The door chimed. Lyric entered hesitantly, his usual sharp posture subdued. He glanced at the untouched data pad in Vryn's hands before speaking. "Sir, we just intercepted a transmission." Vryn turned, his ridges tightening. "From the humans?" Lyric shook his head. "No, from the Empire." Something in his voice made Vryn's skin prickle. He took the pad and skimmed through the message. His eyes widened. The High Command had already received reports of the battle. But they weren't concerned about the losses. They were concerned about something else. They knew, Vryn muttered, gripping the pad tighter. They knew the humans had these weapons. Lyric's jaw tensed. "It appears so." Vryn's thoughts raced. The Empire had sent them in, fully aware of what humanity was capable of. Had they expected a massacre? A test of strength? Or worse, had they wanted to provoke something? He scrolled further. A second order had been issued. The fleet was not to return to Keshri space. They were being rerouted. Vryn's breath caught. "They're sending us deeper into human territory?" Lyric nodded grimly. "We're to make contact with one of their outer colonies." His voice dropped lower. "Sir, I don't think this is a retreat." Vryn looked at the screen again. The coordinates were precise, deliberate. The Empire wasn't backing down. They weren't afraid. They wanted more information. They wanted to see how far humanity would go. A cold realization settled over him. The humans had been willing to let them go once. But if they pushed further, if they crossed into territory they had no right to be in, would that mercy still hold? The war hadn't ended. It had only just begun. Vryn stood on the bridge, staring at the cold glow of the star map. The fleet was nearing the coordinates High Command had sent. A human colony world lightly defended, an easy target, according to the Empire's intelligence. But Vryn knew better now. Nothing about humanity was ever truly defenseless. Lyric shifted beside him. "Sir, if the humans retaliate the way they did over Earth," he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Vryn exhaled sharply. "They will." The crew moved with quiet unease. No one spoke of it, but they all felt it, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. The humans had let them go once. But that had been a warning, not an invitation. And now they were breaking that unspoken agreement. A beeping sound cut through the silence. The sensor officer's hands hovered over the controls, his crest twitching. "Sir, we're picking up something ahead." Vryn leaned forward. "More human ships?" The officer hesitated. "Not exactly." The display flickered to life, showing the dark expanse ahead. At first, it looked empty. Then the image sharpened. There was something there, something massive. Not just one ship. A fleet. No more than that. An armada. Rows upon rows of human warships, hanging in the void waiting. They hadn't chased the Keshri. They hadn't fired first. They had simply predicted exactly where they would go. And they had been waiting. A transmission request appeared on the screen. Without waiting for approval, the humans had opened the channel themselves. Admiral Kessler's face appeared again, calm as ever. "I told you once to leave," he said. His voice was quiet, but behind it was something heavy, final. "You didn't listen." Vryn's heart pounded. This was no longer a warning. This was the moment before the storm hit. Kessler leaned slightly forward. "You came here thinking you were the hunters. You thought we were the prey." His expression darkened. "You were wrong." The transmission cut out. And before Vryn could issue an order, the human fleet fired. The void lit up with flashes of metal and fire. The first Keshri ships barely had time to react before the rounds hit, tearing through hulls as if they were made of paper. The railguns struck with merciless precision, disabling engines, slicing through shields as if they weren't even there. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. The humans fought with a brutal efficiency that made it clear. This was not their first war. Vryn's ship shook violently as a kinetic round skimmed past, ripping a nearby cruiser in half. Alarms blared, damage reports flooded the screens. The Keshri fleet was unraveling. Lyric turned, panic in his eyes. We can't win this. Vrynn clenched his jaw. He knew. He had known from the moment he saw those ships waiting for them. The Empire had sent them into a trap of their own making, underestimating the one species that could not afford to lose. And now they were paying the price. Another explosion rocked the ship. Consoles sparked, filling the air with the acrid scent of burning metal. The battle was lost. There was no salvaging it. Vryn's claws dug into his armrest. He had a choice, fight and die here, or surrender and face whatever fate the humans decided for them. Neither option was appealing, but one of them kept his crew alive. The words burned in his throat, but he forced them out. Send a transmission. Surrender. Lyric hesitated, then nodded. As the message was sent, the gunfire ceased. The silence that followed was more deafening than the battle itself. A response came almost immediately. Kessler's face appeared once more, expression unreadable. Smart choice. The screen shifted, showing something new, something unexpected. Not Earth. Not their fleet. A Keshri War Council chamber. High Command. And standing in the center of the room, surrounded by human soldiers, was the Supreme Commander of the Empire. Vryn's breath caught. How? Kessler watched him carefully. Your leaders sent you to die, he said, while they were already negotiating their own surrender. Vryn's mind reeled. The Empire had never intended to fight. They had used his fleet as bait, sacrificing them to see if the humans would break. And while his crew fought, while his people burned, their leaders had already given up. Kessler's voice was cold. This war never started, Commander. Because your Empire knew they'd already lost. The screen went dark. Vrynn stared at the empty display. Everything he had believed in, everything he had fought for, it had all been a lie. The humans had won before the first shot was ever fired. Vrynn sat in the dim light of his quarters, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound breaking the silence. His claws rested lightly on the edge of his desk, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The battle, the surrender, the truth, it all blurred together in a whirlwind that refused to settle. His people had been sacrificed, not by the humans, but by their own leaders. The Keshri Empire had never planned to win. They had known, long before Vrynn ever set foot on his command deck, that humanity was beyond them. And instead of preparing, instead of finding another way, they had sent his fleet into the fire, knowing they would never return. A soft chime echoed through the room. Lyric stepped inside, his usual sharp presence dulled by exhaustion. He hesitated before speaking. We just received final orders from High Command. Vrynn didn't look up. High Command no longer exists. Lyric took a breath. The remnants of it do. What's left of the Council is negotiating full terms with the humans. He hesitated. They're ordering all fleets to stand down. It was over. Not just the battle, not just this mission. The war. The Empire, which had once seen itself as untouchable, had collapsed without a single human soldier needing to set foot on Keshri soil. Vrynn felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had spent his entire life believing in the strength of the Empire, in its power, its right to rule. And now he was left with nothing but the bitter truth. None of it had ever mattered. Because the moment they had crossed paths with humanity, their fate had been sealed. He glanced at Lyric. What happens to us? Lyric's ridges twitched slightly. Admiral Kessler has granted us safe passage. We will be escorted to a neutral station, where we will be allowed to return home. A pause. If we still have one. Home. The word felt hollow. Would there even be an empire left when they arrived? Or just the ruins of one, bowing before a species they had never understood? The ship's comms crackled. This is Admiral Kessler. All Keshri vessels, you are now under human escort. Any aggression will be met with force. The message was cold, efficient, just like everything else the humans had done. There was no mockery, no gloating. Just fact. Vrynn stood, his movements slow but deliberate. Set a course. Lyric hesitated. Sir? We follow their escort. We return home. His voice was quiet, but there was no doubt in it. And we remember. Lyric didn't ask what he meant. He simply nodded and left. Vrynn turned back to the viewport, staring out at the human fleet. The ships that had shattered everything he knew. He had spent so long believing that war was about strength. That victory belonged to those with the most firepower, the most discipline, the most strategy. But the humans had won not just because of their weapons. They had won because they understood something the Keshri never had. War was not about proving superiority. It was about survival. And when a species fights with its back against the wall, when it has known nothing but war for centuries, it does not hesitate. It does not falter. It does not give second chances. They had let the Keshri live not out of mercy, but because they didn't need to kill them to win. The war had been over before the first battle ever began. The stars stretched endlessly before him, cold and vast. Somewhere among them, his homeworld awaited. What he would find there, he did not know. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. As the ship turned, following its escort, Vryn let out a slow breath. The Keshri Empire had fallen, and humanity had taken its place among the stars.